Here's something nobody in Washington wants to say out loud. Russia, the country that once rattled the entire world with nuclear threats and KGB power, is now economically on its knees, and the one holding the leash isn't America. It's China. Let that sink in. Since Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, Western sanctions didn't just punish Moscow, they handed Moscow to Beijing on a silver platter. Before the war, the Chinese yuan accounted for less than 2% of Russia's trade. Today, nearly 90% of all Russia-China transactions are settled in yuan and rubles. Think about what that means. Russia, a nuclear superpower, has swapped its dollar dependency for a yuan dependency. They essentially swapped dollar dependence for reliance on the yuan, and that is not freedom. That is a different kind of trap. By 2024, Russia was importing 60% of its new passenger cars and 65% of its trucks from China, even as Russian domestic producers cut their work weeks down to 4 days because they couldn't compete. Russian imports of Chinese goods surged from 23% of total imports in 2021 to 57% in 2024. That's not a partnership. That's a dependency. That's a colonial-style economic relationship dressed up in diplomatic language. And here is the part that should genuinely alarm you. A Chinese cyber espionage group known as APT-31 quietly penetrated Russian technology firms for years, and Moscow appears unwilling to confront Beijing publicly about it. Russia knows it's being spied on. Russia knows it's being monitored, and Russia stays silent because it has no choice. China wants to keep Russia strong enough to challenge the West, but not so strong that it escapes Beijing's orbit. That is not an alliance. That is a leash, and Russia is wearing it. By early 2026, Russia's far eastern region of Primorie has the makings of becoming almost completely subordinate to Chinese economic needs, with Chinese capital and infrastructure reshaping entire Russian border regions in ways that serve Beijing's priorities first. So the real question isn't whether China is quietly taking over Russia. The real question is, how did the most sanctioned nation on earth end up serving the economic interests of the world's rising superpower? And what does that mean for every single one of us here in America? Because the power shift happening right now between Beijing and Moscow isn't just their problem, it's ours. Let's go back to the beginning for a second, because to understand what's happening right now between China and Russia, you have to understand the moment that everything changed. February 4th, 2022. Just 20 days before Russian tanks started rolling into Ukraine, Vladimir Putin flew to Beijing. He sat down with Xi Jinping at the Winter Olympics opening ceremony, and the two of them signed what they called a no-limits partnership. No limits. Those were their actual words. They wanted the world to know they were together, they were unified, and they were going to challenge the American-led international order. The optics were stunning. Two nuclear powers standing shoulder to shoulder, declaring that there were no limits to how far they'd go for each other. It felt like a historic moment for both of them. What neither man said out loud, and what neither man probably fully understood yet, was that this partnership would very quickly stop being a partnership between equals and become something else entirely. Because here's what happened next. Russia invaded Ukraine. The West sanctioned Moscow with a ferocity that nobody had really prepared for. And suddenly, Putin found himself with no European energy buyers, no Western technology, no access to international banking systems, and no real alternatives except one: China. And that single fact, more than anything else in modern geopolitics, has restructured the power balance between these two countries in a way that may be permanent. Think about what Russia actually needed once those sanctions hit. They needed buyers for their oil and gas, because that's how the Russian government funds itself, raw energy exports. They needed technology because Russian industry depends heavily on foreign microchips and components that Western companies were no longer allowed to sell. They needed machinery, cars, consumer goods, because Western brands left Russia overnight. Over 1,000 Western companies packed up and walked out. And they needed financial infrastructure because SWIFT access was gone, dollar-denominated trade was compromised, and Russia's foreign reserves were partially frozen. China stepped in to fill every single one of those gaps. China delivered shipments of goods sanctioned by the West to Russia both directly and through intermediaries, including Hong Kong, Kazakhstan, and Turkey. And by 2023, China accounted for 89% of Russia's microchip imports. 89%. Think about that. The most basic building blocks of modern technology, the chips that go into weapons, into tanks, into communication systems, Russia was now getting almost entirely from China, and the trade numbers tell a story that is impossible to ignore. More than 90% of foreign direct investment in Russia's Far East was being financed by Chinese state companies, covering 26 infrastructure projects worth over $1.6 billion. Chinese automobile brands flooded in to replace BMW, Mercedes, and Volkswagen. Chinese smartphones took over shelves that had been stocked with Samsung and Apple. Chinese household appliances replaced Bosch and Siemens. Russia didn't just turn east after 2022. Russia was absorbed east. And here's the critical part that most analysts either miss or deliberately understate. Beijing did all of this on its own terms. China didn't help Russia out of loyalty. China helped Russia because a weakened, dependent Russia is extraordinarily useful to China's long-term global ambitions. A Russia that needs you is very, very different from a Russia that chooses you. Now let's talk about the geography, because this is where the story gets truly alarming, and I don't use that word lightly. Russia has a region called the Far East. It's enormous. We're talking about a landmass that is larger than the entire country of India. It's rich in timber, in minerals, in oil, in natural gas, in fresh water. It is arguably one of the most naturally wealthy pieces of land on the entire planet. But here's the problem for Moscow. Barely anyone lives there. Since 1990, the Russian Far East has lost around a quarter of its population, largely due to outward migration. Russians don't want to live there. The winters are brutal, the infrastructure is poor, and Moscow has chronically underfunded the region for decades. So you have this vast, resource-rich wilderness that Russia owns on paper, but increasingly cannot manage in practice. And right across the border, over 100 million Chinese citizens in northeastern China alone. The demographic and economic pressure that creates is not something you can sanction away or legislate away. It's a fact of geography. It is the reality on the ground every single day. Russia, cut off from Western capital and markets, increasingly relies on China for investment, infrastructure, technology, and buyers for its raw materials. And this dependence gives Beijing leverage to demand long-term land leases, resource concessions, and infrastructure projects, railways and pipelines, that deepen Chinese control. And China has been extraordinarily strategic about how it enters this region. Not with tanks, not with flags, with investment, with labor, with pipelines, with cultural centers. At the 34th Harbin Industrial Trade Fair in May 2025, a Chinese delegation expressed readiness to invest 22 billion rubles in constructing a major transportation hub in Nizhny Leninskoye that connects China with Russia's Jewish Autonomous Oblast. Transportation hubs, railways, ports. Who do you think those transportation routes are designed to serve? Not Moscow. They point toward Beijing. They funnel Russia's natural resources toward Chinese markets. The infrastructure being built in Russia's Far East is not building Russian economic sovereignty. It is building Chinese economic access. Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service warned that Moscow could lose effective authority over as much as 40% of its national territory, an area approaching 7 million square kilometers, and that Russia is increasingly paying its allies for support in the war against Ukraine with its own territory. Russia is paying for Chinese support in a war it started, and the price is its own land. Let that land in your mind for a moment. A country that launched a war to expand its territory is quietly forfeiting a different part of its territory to the very partner it thought was helping it. If that isn't one of the great strategic miscalculations of the modern era, I don't know what is. And let's not forget the energy dimension, because this is where China's leverage is most exposed and most ruthless. Putin had big dreams for the power of Siberia 2 pipeline, a massive project that would pump Russian natural gas from Western Siberia directly into China, replacing the European market he lost when he invaded Ukraine. For years, Putin has been pushing for this deal. It would have been a lifeline. It would have given Russia a replacement customer for the energy revenues that Europe once provided. During Putin's September 2025 visit to China, efforts to secure major new deals yielded little. Modest increases in gas and oil contracts represent only fractions of Russian output, while the much-touted power of Siberia 2 pipeline remains unconfirmed by China. China is dragging its feet, on purpose. Because why would you rush to sign a deal that locks in the price when the seller is desperate and getting more desperate by the month? Xi Jinping doesn't need to invade Russia. He doesn't need to send a single soldier across the border. He just needs to wait. He just needs to keep saying, we're still talking about it, while Russia bleeds money on the battlefield in Ukraine and becomes more dependent on Chinese goodwill with every passing quarter. This is what strategic patience looks like when executed by one of history's most calculating governments. And the Americans who think this is simply a distant problem for two faraway countries to sort out are making a mistake that we will all pay for eventually. Now, some people at this point will push back and say, but wait, China is also helping Russia militarily. They're sending drones, they're sharing intelligence. Doesn't that make them genuine allies? And this is a fair question, so let me address it directly. In October 2025, China deepened its support for Russia's war effort through intelligence sharing, expanded drone supplies, and closer military cooperation, while simultaneously managing sanctions risks and defending its diplomatic posture on the conflict. Yes, China is helping Russia fight, but look at how China is helping. They're providing components, not soldiers. They're sharing satellite imagery and drone technology, but they are not openly deploying their own military. They are letting Russia take every casualty, absorb every sanction, bear every reputational cost, while China gets to buy discounted Russian oil, expand into Russian territory, and avoid being directly sanctioned by the West. China wants to keep Russia strong enough to challenge the West, but not so strong that it escapes Beijing's orbit. Russia is being kept on life support, just functional enough to keep fighting, just weak enough to keep needing China. That's not an alliance. That's management. And if you think Putin doesn't know this on some level, you're underestimating him. The Russian elites know. There are reports of insiders in Moscow quietly criticizing Beijing for exploiting Russia rather than acting as a true partner. The sharp downturn in Russian-Chinese trade in 2025, with bilateral trade falling nearly 9% over the first 8 months of the year, has alarmed the Kremlin, with insiders criticizing Beijing for exploiting Moscow rather than acting as an ally. China pulled back its purchases of Russian oil, pulled back on coal, pulled back on LNG, right when Russia needed those revenue streams most. This is what a junior partner looks like when it finally notices that the senior partner is not losing sleep over its problems. And here's the historical angle that nobody wants to bring up in polite company, but I will, because it's real and it matters. In Chinese history, almost all of Siberia, including regions as far west as Tomsk, were once considered part of China's territory, lost through what Beijing calls the unequal treaties of the 19th century, when Tsarist Russia annexed the Amur and Far East regions. China signed those treaties under duress. They have never fully forgotten. The Chinese government doesn't advertise this grievance loudly. They're too smart for that, but it lives in their textbooks, in their national consciousness, in the background of every negotiation they have with Moscow. And now, for the first time in modern history, China has the economic power, the demographic pressure, and the geographic opportunity to begin reclaiming influence over that region without firing a single shot. Rather than marching in, China benefits more from a creeping takeover, buying land and resources under long-term leases, expanding Chinese business ownership and migration in border towns, and locking Russia into infrastructure that points east, not west. Let's also talk about what this means for us, for Americans, because that's the conversation I actually want to have. Some people tune out when the discussion turns to Russia and China because they think it's a foreign policy problem for the diplomats to handle. It is not a foreign policy problem. It is an American security problem. Because a Russia permanently locked into China's orbit, permanently dependent on Beijing for its economic survival, is a Russia that becomes China's instrument of geopolitical disruption. Leaked Russian documents analyzed by the Royal United Services Institute show that Moscow has been supplying Beijing with anti-tank guns, parachute systems, and airborne training that could enhance Beijing's ability to mount operations against Taiwan within a decade, with researchers suggesting that Russia could encourage such an invasion to drag the United States into a long-term global power struggle. Russia is now essentially acting as a military technology supplier and geopolitical enabler for Chinese ambitions in Asia. The war in Ukraine did not just redraw European borders, it has restructured the entire strategic landscape that American military planners and policymakers have to operate within. And none of this happened in a vacuum. Western sanctions, however justified morally, had unintended consequences that we need to be honest about. We pushed Russia out of the Western financial system and directly into China's arms. We closed European markets to Russian energy and handed Beijing a decade's worth of discounted oil. We isolated Moscow and inadvertently strengthened the very partnership that poses the greatest long-term challenge to American global leadership. I'm not saying the sanctions were wrong. I'm saying that strategy without a plan for second and third order consequences is not strategy. It's improvisation dressed up in policy language. Meanwhile, China raised its defense spending by 7% in 2026, continuing a steady military buildup aimed at modernizing its armed forces by 2035, and now accounts for nearly 44% of Asia's total military expenditure, up from an average of 37% in the previous decade. China is not slowing down. It is not getting cautious. It is using the stability that Russia's distraction in Ukraine provides to accelerate its own military modernization, expand its economic reach in Russia's backyard, and position itself as the uncontested dominant power in Asia. Every month that Russia bleeds in Ukraine is a month that China gets stronger, gets richer, and gets deeper roots in the ground. So what is actually happening between China and Russia? Is China taking over Russia? Not in the way that most people imagine a takeover looks. There are no Chinese soldiers marching through Red Square. Putin is still giving speeches. Russian flags still fly. But power is not just about flags and speeches. Power is about who holds the debt, who controls the supply chain, who decides whether a pipeline gets built, who sets the price for oil, and who gets to say no. And right now, on every single one of those questions, the answer increasingly points east toward Beijing. Russia is certainly the junior partner in the no limits partnership. That's not my characterization. That's what analysts at the Atlantic Council, people who study this for a living, are willing to put in writing. The junior partner, the lesser power, the one who needs more than it is needed, that is the truth about what is happening between China and Russia. Not a military conquest, not a formal annexation, but a slow, methodical, patient economic and strategic absorption. And Russia, exhausted by war, isolated by sanctions, and desperate for any partner willing to stand with it, walked right into it. The question for us, for America, is whether we are paying close enough attention to understand what comes next. Because when two of the world's largest nuclear powers become permanently bound in a relationship where one increasingly controls the other, that is not a regional concern. That is a defining fact of the world our children are going to grow up in. And we better start talking about it like we mean it.